Okay, hello everyone and welcome back to my YouTube channel. All right, two things before we start today's video lecture. Now, the first thing is I would like to make a request. Well, not a monetary request, but if you feel that I've brought anything of value into your life, you feel that my channel has brought anything of value, do please click the subscribe button if you haven't subscribed to my channel. It only takes one click, and whenever a new video comes out, you'll be the first to know. Okay, so I hope that you'll help me by subscribing. And second of all, I do apologize in advance for the sound quality in this video because I live in the city center. Now, my condo is in the city center, so it's quite busy, in the early morning. Traffic is really, really heavy. So you're going to hear the sound of vehicles whirring. I do apologize for that. I might rent out a studio for my future videos, so yeah. Now, without further ado, let's begin. Okay. In ancient India and in some less enlightened parts of the world today, there is a system known as the caste system. Now, on top of this social hierarchy are people such as monks and priests, holy peoples called the Brahmin. Below the Brahmin are the Kshatriya, who constitute the warriors, royalty, and aristocracy. Below them are the Vaishya, or commoners, people like you and I, such as merchants, farmers, artisans, and YouTubers. Below the Vaishya is the second lowest rung of all, just above the untouchables, known as the Sudra. Now, the Sudra would be people like indentured servants, like slaves, prisoners of war, and even barbers. In ancient India, being a barber was considered a low status profession. Now, the caste system, according to Hindu tradition, decreed that one's caste was preordained by karmic merit, and for one to attempt to change from one caste to the next or to intermarry within the caste was a sin against nature. Gautama Buddha and Mahatma Gandhi were both beneficiaries of this system, being born into the Kshatriya and Brahmin caste, respectively. The Buddha was a prince who lived about 2,400 years ago, and he literally had the whole of the Indian peninsula at his feet, while Gandhi was given the opportunity to be educated abroad. Now, these two men were both recipients of caste privilege, yet, ironically, they also wanted to dismantle the oppressive system altogether. Well, of course, this did not sit very well with many stick-in-the-mud traditionalists who decried them as heathens, going against the establishment. The Buddha and his followers were hated by the majority of people in their society for their woke and revolutionary ideas of equality, and they were insulted and spat on by the defenders of the establishment. And when Buddha attempted to teach his students using the practical way by bringing in the barber Upali, some of the monks and nuns were so shocked and horrified that they thought their teacher had gone off his rocker, because it was unthinkable at the time for a Sudra to want to aspire towards Brahmin status. And were it not for the protection of King Bimbisara of Magadha, who was a firm and dedicated disciple of the Buddha and arguably the first Buddhist martyr, they might have been executed for heresy. Buddha and his followers never really were very popular their lifetime, and after Buddha died, the philosophy nearly died out, because people thought they were just a bunch of crazy, deranged, far-left hippies But even today, hardcore Hindus still consider Buddha to be a fool, you know. I actually have friends who believe in the caste system even today, you know, not willing to give up their privileges, perhaps. The Buddha, having passed away nearly 2,500 years ago, has joined the realm of distant memory, of course, but it isn't difficult to imagine how the insane Hindu nationalists would treat him today. Now, in the time of the Buddha, you might hear time and again people speaking of progress when someone from the Sudra caste dines with a priest, or when a man from the Kshatriya caste marries a woman from the Sudra caste. Ultimately, this type of progress is problematic because it does not denote real equality, but only an illusion of it. Now, let me explain. Despite the fact that the castes are interacting as equals, that does not mean that they are. As long as the system still exists, they still exist on a plane of hierarchy, of superior to inferior, master to subordinate. And the idea of transcending one's caste, rising above one's caste in upward mobility is also problematic because you have not really destroyed oppression and inequality, but have merely become complicit in it. You have merely risen from oppressed to oppressor. So if you can understand this, then you can understand why aspiring for white adjacency or model minority status is problematic. Now, if races of this world were castes, according to the conceptualization of most white supremacists, Europeans would be the Brahmins, Asians would be the Kshatriyas and Vaishyas, and the so-called primitive races such as dark Africans and Aboriginals would be the Sudras. Well, they would be the Sudras, but in Hitler's worldview, Jews and Gypsies would be the untouchables. Now, if one is to be equal on the basis of being similar to a white person, then that is not real equality, because that equality is still based on a hierarchy of superior to inferior, master to subordinate, you know. Now, I understand that this may be construed, this totem pole that I've listed may be construed as an extremely crude generalization, and there do exist exceptions to this, you know. For instance, a very, very submissive and compliant Black man like Thomas Sowell, who goes beyond the point of Anglo bootlicking to shoving the entire Anglo-Western boot down his throat, might be able to be accepted as an honorary Aryan. Now, don't forget, Emil Mohis, you know, one of Hitler's closest associates, was Jewish. And he was declared an honorary Aryan by the Führer because Hitler felt he was white adjacent enough and loyal enough to the Nazi cause for his taste. So if one is to be equal on the basis of being similar to the oppressor or similar to the dominant majority, then that is not real equality. Because, well, equality is still rooted in this hierarchy of superior to inferior. In order to be equal, the minority must hyphenate and keep his head low, so to speak. However, there's no obligation on the part of the white man to melanate. The burden of assimilation rests solely on the said colored minority into Anglo-Western culture and the abandonment and ridicule of his or her own cultural heritage. I've spoken time and again against the dubious honor of Asians being called the model minority, because I honestly, from the bottom of my heart, feel it is an extremely insidious machination employed by the Anglo establishment, you know, Western countries, in order to stoke tensions between the different racial subgroups by assigning, you know, good minority status, bad minority status to certain minorities. But when Chinese first arrived in the country in droves in the 1800s, they were hardly the white man's favorite minority. They were seen as an extremely dangerous threat to white hegemony due to their work ethic and their, their immense drive. And they were seen as a real threat because they could actually supplant the white man. In the same way, some people perceive the Chinese in Southeast Asia to be supplanting the local communities. The character Fu Manchu, who is a megalomaniacal dictator and sexual deviant, was a cautionary tale written by Westerners about the yellow peril, aka what would happen if Asian men like myself were to achieve global hegemony. Even today, xenophobic Western media still warns us about the dystopian future for whites if the Asian man were to usurp the white man's place at the top of the quote unquote social Darwinian hierarchy. As a matter of fact, entire Japanese families were incarcerated in concentration camps during World War II, while German American families, for the most part, remained untouched in America. And to show just how much they loved us, the white establishment even dropped 2 atomic bombs on them on yellow munchkins when they were preparing to surrender. But over time, as Asian Americans became more prosperous due to the influx of skilled Asian immigrants seeking greener pastures in the post-World War II era, the white man decided that, well, he had to change his tactics. He now figured, rather than being outwardly hostile to Asians, he could now very cynically use them as a bulwark against minorities that he found even less tolerable, notably the darker ones, and to opportunistically use Asians to prove that systemic racism and discrimination really doesn't exist in America, but that blacks were at the bottom of the racial totem pole simply due to their own intellectual deficiency and poor choices. He would pretend to be more congenial to the Asian, throwing the Asians some crumbs of acceptance while reserving the largest slice of the pie for himself. Now, the problem with that is that, the Asian American and the African American stories are too vastly different for there to be any accurate side-by-side comparison, since the metrics for comparison are too vastly different. Unlike the generally skilled and educated Asian migrants, the cream of the crop of Asian society who came to America willingly in the latter part of the 20th century, the ancestors of the blacks were taken unwillingly, stripped of their heritage and culture, and turned into slaves. Whites didn't even want them to learn how to read or write, or to educate themselves. And this persisted in the post-abolition period all the way to the civil rights movement of the 60s, when, a black guy just wanting to read a book was considered controversial, and they weren't even allowed to use public libraries. Now, thus, white America created a vicious cycle of impoverished and uneducated African Americans from which they've only begun to emerge in recent decades, right? It is a vicious cycle that was created by certain, factors in the past, right? Also, with no sense of their own African culture, African Americans looked to white Americans as their model to follow. But since they were living in less affluent neighborhoods, many African Americans ended up emulating white Western rednecks and hillbillies, as opposed to the more cultured and polished white Western folk, right? Now, that's not to say that all African Americans, it's not to speak of all African Americans. I'm just saying that that is an unfortunate trend that occurred, due to economic factors that were beyond their control. When Asians come to the West, on the other hand, we're known as the middleman minority. So A lot of people unfortunately assume that to mean white adjacent, but it really, really is not, right? Basically, we're too culturally alien to be truly accepted in white circles, right? Even most Asian international students do find it hard making local white friends, speaking from the perspective of a former international student. Now, most of the white students, they were polite, they were civilized, but there's always a barrier between you and them because you're too culturally alien for their taste. And at the same time, even though we're too culturally alien to be accepted in white circles, at the same time, we're called the ideal minority. Not European enough to be fully accepted, but, white enough to be tolerated, So, but do they really like us for us? No, just because you enjoy Chinese food or have an Asian wife does not mean that you actually like Asians as people. I know some pretty questionable white dudes with yellow fever who will tout the model minority line in an attempt to use Asians as a bulwark to shift Black resentment to Asians. Yet at the same time, these dudes have certainly no love for their brother-in-law. And at their very core, they dislike Asian men and Asian culture and expect their Asian wives or girlfriends to hyphenate and embrace the culture of the West and discard the culture of the East. A young Japanese woman named Hiroko, who married an American GI, had this to say: "My in-laws wanted me to change. They wanted me in Western clothes. So did my husband. So I went upstairs and put on something else, and the kimono was put away for many years." And if you think that Asians don't face discrimination, this is what Atsuko, another war bride, had to say. "I go to look at a home or apartment, and when they saw me, they'd say it was already taken. They thought I would lower the real estate value. It was like blockbusting to make sure Blacks wouldn't move into a neighborhood. And it was hurtful." Here's a fun fact. The white establishment in the Anglo-West does not like Asians any more than other minorities, but rather they only dislike us less. Think about that. Let that sink in over the next couple of hours. But if you ask me, I will say that Asian Americans and African Americans are same but different. It's the same with Asians in Australia and Aboriginal Australians. Unless they go out of their way to hyphenate, they are viewed as the foreigner. They're viewed as with suspicion by the dominant majority. So this is going to make some Asian Americans very, very angry. And I already have mentally prepared myself to lose a couple of followers for this, but I assure you, I do not intend to make you angry. But I'll say that although the Asian American experience is far from perfect, Asian Americans have historically, as a whole, not been, they not been subjected to the same degree of humiliation and abuse as African Americans have. Now, if African Americans are angry with Asian Americans, one way of looking at it is simply that they are jealous of Asian Americans for having achieved the success, respect, and prosperity as a collective that Asian Americans as a community enjoy, overcoming racial barriers apparently, and succeeding in white America. But another less common and certainly more controversial view to take is that disenfranchised Blacks may, due to the model minority bullshit, now view Asians as a white man's crony and are envious of the honorary Aryan status that they seem to enjoy. The white man certainly praises us when convenient, yet is always willing to it's the honorary Aryan status that we seem to enjoy. We are now viewed as the white man's crony, so that's something that's that you need to think about as well. Sorry, I forgot to flip this slide. I should have done that. Yeah, So, yeah, the white man certainly praises us when it's convenient, but he's always willing to dehumanize us in his media by portraying our men as patriarchal woman oppressors and our women as easy pickings for white men. Now, also, could the African American zeitgeist have been hardened by their experiences with the white men? And are they now treating Asians with the same kind of contempt that the white man has historically treated them? Now, remember, it's not unheard of for women who have been mistreated by their mothers-in-law to take on the role of abuser when they become mothers-in-law in the future. If African Americans are, for the sake of arguments, abusive and lawless, then who taught them this abusive and lawless behavior? Would they have learned it from their African culture, which was stripped to them for over 200 years ago? Or are they just, as some in the white establishment pushing the model minority narrative, inherently lawless and violent people who need to be policed more than Asians? Olaudah Equiano, the former slave who became a freeman, had this to say: "Our women too were, in my eyes at least, uncommonly graceful, alert, and modest to a degree of bashfulness. Nor do I remember to have ever heard of an instance of incontinence amongst them before marriage. They are also remarkably cheerful. Indeed, cheerfulness and affability are two of the leading characteristics of our nation. We are totally unacquainted with swearing and all those terms of abuse and reproach which find their way so readily and copiously into the language of more civilized people. The only expressions of that kind I remember were, 'May you rot,' or 'May you swell,' or 'May a beast take you.' Those prisoners which were not sold or redeemed, we kept as slaves, but how different was their condition from that of the slaves in the West Indies? With us, they do no more work than other members of the community, than even their master. Their food, clothing, and lodging were nearly in the same as theirs, except that they were not permitted to eat with those who were free-born." Okay, so I hope that's done for you. That's I hope that the message has sinked in right now. So, are African Americans inherently lawless and violent savages? Or, but if they were generally civilized before they encountered the Anglo-West, then who really is to blame for the predicament that America finds itself in now? I've come to realize over the years that some Asian men's idea of empowerment does not mean dismantling white or Western supremacy, but rather being accepted by the elites in the dominant majority, Now, while these men may hypocritically decry the fact that Asian women are dating Caucasian men at a higher rate than any other race, and they don't like the fact that, some Asian women only date Caucasian men. Deep in the depths of their heart, they too want to be in the shoes of their Asian sister. They too want to be accepted by white circles like their Asian sister presumably has. And their anger at Asian women who date and marry white men stems largely from a place of jealousy at her quote unquote acceptance by white circles. And if the white man breaks bread with them and they can get some beautiful blonde Nordic girl on their arm, that is, in their view, the ultimate achievement. That is what they consider to be empowerment. And as a person of color, this model minority notion is problematic. Being accepted by the white elites is problematic because racial equality should be carved out on our own terms, not on whether or not the white man approves of me. Equality has nothing to do with whites, said Malcolm X. We don't want to be equal with the white man. He is not the criteria or yardstick by which equality is measured. He is not in a position to tell us that we are equal. It is not his right. Whatever the white man gives you away, no, whatever the white man gives you today, he can take away tomorrow. Today, he may call you his friend, but tomorrow, if you do or say anything to make him feel threatened, he will regard you as his bitter enemy that needs to be destroyed. Your place at his dining table is always a tenuous one, and you never know when he's going to throw you out. The moment you stop kowtowing to him or being useful to him as a bulwark against minorities that he finds even less tolerable, aka, for example, African Americans, you will very soon lose your model minority cards. As long as the Asians have a very, very tenuous seat at the white man's table, there will always be Asians who willingly punch down on or gaslight disenfranchised blacks for white approval, using the same white supremacist talking points, fueling the flames of animosity between our Black and Asian communities. Now, at the risk of sounding like a so-called boba liberal, I will say that while it is inexcusable that there are people from the African-American community who are so cowardly targeting Asians due to internalized colonialism, not daring up to punch down, not daring to punch up at white men. I will say that I cannot ignore the very troubling element of anti-Blackness in our Asian activist communities, which I feel is hurting our movement more than it is helping us. Don't you see? When our communities are at odds with each other, when we view each other with vitriol and hostility, we are giving the Anglo establishment exactly what it wants, right? The British, one of the first things they did when they came to Southeast Asia was divide and conquer. Divide the Chinese from the Malays, when they were in Africa, divide the Belgians, divided the Tutsis from the Hutus, and that had profoundly horrific implications for future race relations. In Australia, they divided the lighter skinned Aboriginals from the darker skinned ones. Don't you see? It's divide and conquer. Look, remember the pencil metaphor I used in the previous video? When we are divided, we are like a single pencil, easy to break, easy to rule. When we are united, when minorities are united, we're like a bundle of pencils, far more difficult to break. And believe it or not, Black and Asian unity, contrary to what people in the establishment keep saying, is something that they hate seeing. They hate Black Asian unity. That's something that they do not want. To any of you Asian Americans or African Americans who yearn to gain honorary white status, I want to draw your attention to the following acronym. LIFO. What does LIFO stand for? Last in, first out. The fact of the matter is that when your approval by the dominant majority is predicated upon you being an honorary member of the group, your loyalty will always be in question, and you have to go out of your way and jump through hoops, that your white counterpart doesn't have to, in order to avoid arousing suspicion. While there is no expectation on the part of the dominant majority to contort itself to accommodate you, your full commitment to the interests of the dominant majority is expected. If you're a person of color trying to gain acceptance in white circles, you have to go out of your way to hyphenate at a hyperbolic extent, You have to be more proudly British than the British, for example, so to speak. You need to go out of your way to kowtow and appease the dominant majority because you have put all the cards of power into their hands. Yet at the same time, there'll always be an air of distrust that the establishment harbors towards you because, well, they essentially don't like you for you, and the only reason they keep you around is because you promote a very, very specific narrative they want you to promote. But the moment you detract from, they want you to promote this very, very specific narrative that you cannot detract from. The moment you detract from this narrative, the moment you do or say anything that doesn't fit into the optics of the dominant majority, they will cast you out like a leper. It's the same with homosexuals like Dave Rubin, who try to curry favor with the American right wing, or women who try to curry favor with the manosphere, or in the case I've talked about in this video, people of color who try to curry favor with white supremacists. They have to go out of their way to push a narrative of the group they're currying favor with wants them to promote. But don't you dare say anything that would sully the image of the dominant majority. If they do or say anything that goes against the narrative that the dominant majority elites want you to promote, well, even by a remotely microscopic fraction, well, you'll be cast out like a leper. Oh God, yeah, it sounds, yeah, I did apologize in advance, right, for the sound quality. I live in a city center, sorry. But I'd like to end this video on a positive note. When you, as a POC, rise above internalized colonialism, when you as a person of color stop seeking white validation, when you are secure enough in your own identity and comfortable in your own skin, ironically enough, you will get respect. The natural result, I believe, of any person of color who hasn't been white whipped is Bruce Lee or Muhammad Ali. When you stop pandering for white approval and dictate your equality on your own terms, that to me is true progress. Finally, I would like to call for more Black and Asian solidarity. And I implore African Americans and Asian Americans to put aside whatever differences they may perceive and understand that they're not each other's enemy, but allies in the fight against white supremacy. Do not be played against each other like the establishment wants you to be. Do not hate or despise each other or fight each other for the white man's approval. The enemy, as I've said time and again, is not white people. It is the system. The system that has been that is maintained by a few elites. Not white people as a collective, though. The moment you stop playing the game, the moment you realize that other minorities are not your enemy, and the enemy is the system of white supremacy, who are also being screwed over by it, perhaps to a lesser extent than you, but still being screwed over it all the same, then you will be in a better position to progress.